prior to that it was decreasing. So.
Yes, and of course, very good on the video you saw there. Slavery was actually decreasing till the cotton gin. Okay, till the cotton gin, and of course we have an expansion of not only population. Well, in addition to population, you have an expansion of slave population. Also, cotton production increases as well. Okay, and some of that is because of the over cultivation of good land and the free and forced migration of peoples. The people who were not slaves were free and they migrated, but also it was forced migration of people. And I want you to understand that, this was a forced migration. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at this. There's going to be resistance and some rebellion, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Many believe that slavery was going to die out. I put the 3 reasons that you really want to know for the expansion of slavery. The cotton gin, 1808, the end of the international slave trade, and the exhaustion of soil. Slavery spread west and further south. It was already in the south, so that's kind of misleading when I say it expanded in the south. It was already there, but expanding southwest is the key there. Okay, so 3 reasons you want to keep in mind. If I ask you what are 3 reasons slavery expanded, there you go. Can anybody explain why the end of the international slave trade actually increased slavery? Amy, please.
Because more slaves were coming in, most people wanted to keep their slaves and were exchanging.
Okay, and I would also add one other thing to that too. That's a good answer. Don't forget, children of slaves were now almost guaranteed to be slaves. Before, that wasn't always the case. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, okay? Certainly did happen. But now it was almost guaranteed that children of slaves were going to be slaves also. When slavery didn't end, though, there was resistance and rebellion. But this is the big 3 from this slide. This is what I want you to have, okay? Reasons for the expansion of slavery. The cotton engine, called gin for short, 1808. The end of the international slave trade, and the exhaustion of soil. Obviously, the story of slavery, there's a lot of parts to it and a lot of history there. But those are the reasons for the expansion of it. And you could say it all goes back to the Portuguese who brought the first slaves to the Americas. Then the Dutch got in it and got out of it very quickly. And of course, we have the international slave trade. Okay, I want you to know this guy, Denmark Vesey. Let's read the slide first before we try to write everything down. Okay, let's take a look at this. Ella, please.
Denmark Vesey was enslaved in South Carolina. After purchasing his freedom, he planned the largest slave rebellion in history in June 1822. He was betrayed, arrested, and hung before the revolt started. Many anti-slavery activists regarded Vesey as a hero. During the American Civil War, abolitionist Frederick Douglass used Vesey's name as a battle cry to rally African American regiments, especially the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry.
Okay, I want you to know a couple things. First of all, I want you to know Denmark Vesey, that he did plan. Now, he didn't carry out, but he did plan the largest slave rebellion in history. What would have been? There were people that were in the know, so to speak, and ended up turning him in, basically because they did not want to be severely punished, which would have definitely happened. So he did not pull it off, but I want you to be familiar with the name because he inspired others. And I definitely want you to know about that 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. That's why I have it underlined. Okay. The Massachusetts 54th Volunteer Infantry. During the Civil War, the Massachusetts 54th was the first all African American regiment to be created. There were many others, including one from Pennsylvania, but this was the first and by far the most famous. Frederick Douglass's own sons fought in the Massachusetts 54th. Is anybody familiar with who Frederick Douglass was by any chance? Grace.
He was an abolitionist during this time period.
Okay, he definitely was an abolitionist. I agree. Sarah, anything to add?
No.
Okay, we'll talk more about him in a minute. Go ahead, Gracie.
I believe he planned like a revolt.
He did, yes. A very storied man. We'll talk more about him in just a minute. I don't want to jump too far ahead when we talk about Denmark. We'll get to Frederick Douglass in just a minute. Okay, Massachusetts 54th. The Massachusetts 54th, the first all-black regiment created during the Civil War. I want you to be aware of that. What you're looking at is the promotion of the movie Glory. Has anybody ever seen that by any chance? What do you think, Amy? Good movie?
Yeah, it's good.
It's a very good movie. It's very true to history. Sometimes Hollywood fabricates things, but this was very true to the story of the Massachusetts 54th. On a personal note, I think Morgan Freeman, Denzel Washington are two of the greatest actors, and I think any movies that have them in are good, usually. I don't think you can go wrong. And also Matthew Broderick is very famous also. Now they did have white officers, white commanders, okay? But all the recruits were African American. Okay, Frederick Douglass. Very important man to know. After escaping from slavery, he became a leader of the abolitionist movement. He was an escaped slave. Has anybody ever read the book by any chance? Narrative of the Life. That's what somebody did for summer reading.
I did the Secret Six one.
You did the what?
I did the one on the Secret Six.
The Secret Six. A poster somewhere. Which is very much true to that. You see your poster anyway? No, I just saw it.
I saw it over there last week.
Oh, okay, I have the whole poster in front of it. I was using that in another class. The Secret Six is mostly about John Brown, but at the same point, they do certainly mention Frederick Douglass in the story as well. And we'll definitely talk more about John Brown. Frederick Douglass, he was a tremendous orator. They said he had the kind of voice that would tear through a steel door. Became a learned man because he taught himself, and a very strong abolitionist. What you're looking at here is a picture of Frederick Douglass, and that's an actual photograph, with a woman seated beside him. I would like you to be aware of who the woman was in the picture. Her name is Victoria Woodhull. What's interesting about Victoria Woodhull, she ran for president before the 19th Amendment. Now, let me explain some of the 19th Amendment. Before the 19th Amendment, it didn't mean women cannot vote. Okay, if you lived in an area where they allowed women to vote, you were allowed to vote. And Wyoming was the first state to allow, most states out west. But in some areas, especially New York, it was illegal for women to vote. Okay, so her running for president, yeah, women could vote, probably not going to have a great chance of success. But you certainly are looking at some very influential women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we will talk about not next chapter, the chapter afterwards, and Susan B. Anthony, all of which were champions for women's right to vote. Why am I mentioning her now? Take a guess who ran as her vice president. Aiden.
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, yes. Frederick Douglass ran as her vice president. Landmark, okay? Victoria Woodhull ran for president. and Frederick Douglass ran as the vice president. Mentioning something else for Frederick Douglass, he was also the first African American to be invited to the White House. Let me ask you this question. Anybody want to take a guess at which president invited him? There's one that really makes sense. Go ahead. Abraham Lincoln, yes. The first African American man to be invited to the White House, invited by Abraham Lincoln. Ellie, you had a question?
Yeah, who did win the election between Victoria and Hall? Like, who was she running?
1872, it would have actually been, let me think here. That would have been after Grant. It would have been, no, Grant would have been reelected. It would have actually been Ulysses S. Grant would have won. Now, she was never actually officially on a major ballot, okay? She was one of the candidates, okay, to get on the ballot. Okay, Nat Turner. Now, about the only way to know these for the test, you're just going to have to study them and know the details, okay? But Nat Turner, he was a slave preacher. He saw a solar eclipse, and he felt that God called on him to strike the blow for freedom. This was a very controversial rebellion, because in the rebellion, a lot of the former slaves who had escaped and led the rebellion, in some cases, attacked whites indiscriminately. Okay, let's read through this. Kaylee, please.
Nat Turner. Slave preacher Nat Turner felt that God had called on him to lead his people out of slavery. Some of his devoted flock began to call him the prophet. Solar eclipse 1839. God signed his Nat Turner time had come to strike the blow for freedom.
It got very controversial, the rebellion. And again, let me point out, attacking whites indiscriminately, whether they were slave owners or not, whether they, had any support of slavery. I do want to mention Nat Turner's rebellion actually hurt the cause of the abolitionist movement, because some people who were white that were on the side of abolition did not take up the cause anymore. Now, I'm not saying that's fair. I'm going to let you draw your conclusion. I'm not telling you how to think. Okay? But I will tell you this, some would argue, can you blame them? Something to think about. Just asking you to think about it. Okay, let's do this. We'll go over this tomorrow at the beginning. We'll take a look at these questions. Okay? But I want to set up this last part of the chapter, which is going to end with an election. All right, so let's take a look. Review. James Monroe. Spain has ceded Florida. What American was responsible for the U.S. gaining Florida from Spain? Anybody? Anybody? Jackson. Yes, Andrew Jackson. Monroe Doctrine. Can anybody explain the Monroe Doctrine? Maggie, please.
Basically said that you would stay out of Europe and stay out of the Americas.
Yes. And the key word to that would be to add no colonization. Okay, which certainly the Americas were, North, Central, and South European colonies. How about the Missouri Compromise? Let's review that. Amy?
That was when Missouri was accepted as a slave state and named as a free state, and then the 3639 was established.
Okay, and that's going to last for about 30 years. We'll talk more about that. Okay. All right. So to understand this next part, we need to do a little bit of civics here. What vote does a candidate need in order to become president? Good. You must win the Electoral College vote. Keyword majority. What's a majority? Yes, more than half. It can be 0.50000001, and that's a majority. Okay? 5 times in history, the winner did not win the popular vote, but won the electoral vote. And, of course, won the election. Does anybody know any examples of those? Evelyn? Yes, that's one of them. 5 presidents who lost the popular vote, but won the electoral college vote. Now, I'm not going to ask you to write all these down, but I want to give you the 4 examples. Tilden versus Hayes, which we'll definitely talk about this year. Harrison, Cleveland. Bush, Gore in the election of 2000. And Trump, Clinton in 2016. The focus that we want to look at is the last 3 lines. The 6th president is going to be John Quincy Adams. The way I remember that is Quincy has 6 letters. If that works for you, fine. If not, go with however you want to. Take a look at the last 2 lines. John Quincy Adams lost both the popular and the electoral college vote. That I want you to know. How is that possible? How can you lose both the popular and the electoral college, but still win the election? And I'm going to ask you to think about this. Look at who he ran against. Who did he run against? Bryce.
Andrew Jackson.
How do you think Andrew Jackson felt about Quincy Adams winning?
Not very good.
Yeah. Probably said some words that you can't print in your history book. You know, like darn. Right. Now, how could this possibly happen? Anybody have an hypothesis? Go ahead, Bryson.
Andrew Jackson got convicted of some sort of crime or something.
I'm thinking that's not it though. But
Not impeached because he wasn't president yet, or was this his renewal term?
no, he was not president yet.
Okay, well, I don't know.
Go ahead.
Was a corrupt deal cut?
Now we're getting somewhere. Go ahead.
Oh, never mind. I was just going to say
The election of 1824 featured 4 people, and they were all Democrats. Henry Clay, who was a Whig, actually ran on the Democratic ticket. Now, I do want you to be aware of the 4 names, and last name will work. Jackson, Quincy Adams, Crawford, Henry Clay, the father of the American system. They were called America's favorite sons. Jackson, Adams, Crawford, and Clay. Just write down the last names. Don't worry about writing everything down. The only one we haven't talked about was William Crawford. He was actually Secretary of the Treasury under James Monroe. So what I'm telling you is this is the election for the 5th president after Monroe. Monroe's 5. Quincy Adams is going to be 6. Now, how does this all happen? Well, flashback here about Henry Clay. Let's just take a look at this. Don't worry about writing this all down. This is just a review. Okay? Jesse, please.
Henry Clay was a war hawk,
voted for the War of 1812, famous for the American system, and a great compromiser. John Quincy Adams came from Florida, defended Andrew Jackson in Florida, and wrote the Monroe Doctrine. Was considered the greatest Secretary of State ever. New Crawford was from the South, and he believed in the same policies of Jefferson regarding the Constitution and state rights.
Okay. I'm not worried about Crawford. I'm not going to test you on him. When the dust settled after the election, take a look at the numbers. And take a look at the questions. On election day, who won the most popular votes? Aiden.
Jackson.
On election day, who won the most electoral college votes? Amy.
Jackson.
There is a problem here. Look at Jackson's numbers. Do you see the problem? Kaylee, it looks like you grabbed it right away. He did not win the majority. That's the problem. Now look at the last part there. Following the 12th Amendment, who was to decide the winner of the election? Does anybody remember that? Who gets to decide? Go ahead.
House of Reps.
The House of Representatives. Take a guess who the Speaker of the House is. Aiden.
Adams.
No, he's the Secretary of State. Keep going.
But
Henry Clay. Well, since Clay finished fourth, Clay's out. Clay's out of it. They only look at the top three. William Crawford had a stroke, so he's out.
That is, did he
You
die?
people scare me when you laugh and stuff like that.
Did
You
he
know,
die from
that's
it?
scary.
Probably like
You know, maybe we should pay more attention. You know, brother's keeper and stuff. You know. Yeah, a lot more. In fact, I think you need to come here. We need to talk about this. No, he did not die.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Then
he did.
I mean,
Well,
he
he died.
did.
He
He
died.
not from that.
We'd have to talk about
So
something
then
else.
that
If he
is
wasn't
like
that
that.
self-exam, then he
He's dead
All
now.
right, let's read through this. Gracie, please.
No one won a majority. John Quincy Adams lost the popular vote and lost total college votes to Andrew Jackson in 1824. According to the 12th Amendment, the top three have a runoff election in the House of Representatives. Here comes the correct vote.
Make sure you write that real big. Corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain. Now stay with me. We have a few minutes yet. I won't keep you late. The corrupt bargain. Okay? In return for Clay supporting John Quincy Adams. Now remember, Clay is the Speaker of the House. Clay wants to be not Vice President. This is important. Clay wants to be the Secretary of State. Why? Go ahead.
Because at this time, the majority of people who are Secretary of State.
Bingo. Make sure you note that. Clay wants to be Secretary of State because the Secretary of State, in all elections, except for Washington, had become president. All presidents to this point were Secretaries of State. Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe were all Secretaries of State. Clay wants to be Secretary of State. So Clay uses his position in the House of Representatives to influence everybody in the House to make Quincy Adams the president. And it works. Clay then becomes Secretary of State. Meanwhile, Jackson is screaming and hollering and saying nasty things. But there's nothing he can do about it. Henry Clay was called the Judas of the West. Clay and Jackson were both from the West, but Clay supported a New Englander. John Quincy Adams was from Massachusetts. This is the corrupt bargain. Okay? Finish up with this tomorrow. the assignment. Make sure you turn that in tomorrow. Test will be Thursday. You have everything you need, the Quizlet, the review at the end of your handout, and I would just sit down and read over the first couple pages just to refresh your memory. Know the court cases. Study the Quizlet. Have a good day. There's that thing again.
May I have your attention, please?